What if Tensura melting the eternal frost? Author JackDaWeb on Wattpad. This story depicts an alternate timeline wherein Velzard attends Walpurgis after sensing Veldora's presence. She subsequently meets our protagonist and becomes interested in him after his display at the meeting. After thinking for a bit, she decides to move to Tempest and becomes a close ally of Rimuru. Rimuru and Velzard will sometimes be out of character, OOC, as it is unavoidable for this premise. Rimuru, our protagonist, will be more rational and have an actual spine. Velzard, she will not be as cold and ruthless as her canon counterpart. Since Velzard is missing significant characterization in the early parts of the series, the author decided to write his own interpretation of her personality based on the original light novel. Chapter 34, Transcendence over Reality. Rimuru's POV. I watched with thinly veiled disinterest as the hulking man swaggered toward my desk, each step brimming with arrogance so thick it was almost tangible. This clown had the nerve to barge into a high-stakes meeting like he owned the place. Honestly, his mere presence was more annoying than threatening. For a brief moment, I'd hoped the disturbance was caused by those responsible for the earlier spiritual interference, but a quick glance at him and his entourage confirmed otherwise. These people didn't have the skill or the brains to pull off something that sophisticated. The man stopped a few steps in front of me, sizing me up like he was some grand authority. His chest puffed out, eyes narrowing as if he actually posed a threat. HMPH, he sneered. So you're the one calling yourself a demon lord, Rimuru Tempest, was it? The contempt in his voice was impossible to miss. Straight up, huh? No titles or respect, just pure disrespect right to my face. Normally, someone this insignificant wouldn't even register on my radar, but being insulted to my face deserved at least some response. Behind me, I felt my subordinates' anger quietly simmering, their glares practically burning a hole through the hulking figure. You do realize we were holding a crucial meeting, right? I replied, my voice dripping with impatience as I rested my chin on my hands. Are you sure you'll get away with that level of lawlessness? I asked. The man threw his head back in a loud, obnoxious laugh that echoed through the chamber. This guy's bravado was beyond deluded. It was almost fascinating in a grim sort of way. When his laughter finally died down, he sneered again, basking in his own twisted sense of importance. Isn't that hilarious? A monster talking about being lawful, he mused loudly, but no one else seemed to find the humor. The law doesn't matter now, he proclaimed, pulling out a bracelet with an orb embedded in it and holding it up like it was some holy artifact. I have the greatest opportunity right in front of me. When I put this on you, you and all monsters will be under our command, he declared confidently. I blinked, staring at him like he'd lost his mind entirely. My gaze couldn't have been more dismissive if I'd tried, and a sigh slipped out before I could stop it, drawing his attention. What is that, an orb of domination? I asked, my voice as dry as a desert. At my question, a malicious grin spread across his face. Ho, you're pretty smart for a monster, he mocked, clearly savoring the moment. Indeed it is. With this, I can secure the safety of humanity by putting you and all your followers under our control. I almost felt sorry for him. His overconfidence was painfully apparent, and I decided to humor him only to drive home just how flawed his plan was. Rimuru, was it? I asked, watching as his grin widened even further. Leave my name out of your mouth, monster, he spat, trying to sound threatening. Ignoring him, I continued. Let's assume you did put me under control, which, yes, by proxy, means you control all my subordinates, I began, my tone deliberately calm. But I think you're overlooking a pretty crucial detail here. His expression flickered with confusion as my words sank in, the arrogance draining from his face bit by bit. The true dragons aren't my subordinates. They are my allies. I'm not sure if you're following where I'm going with this, so let me spell it out for everyone. I paused, watching the realization slowly dawn on him. Rhaenyr's confusion deepened as I stood up, my gaze sweeping across the council room, ensuring I had their full attention. What do you think will happen to the West if you forcefully take control of someone allied with the Storm Dragon and the Frost Dragon? I asked, my voice carrying a weight that resonated through the room. A ripple of understanding spread across the councilors' faces as they finally began to comprehend the stakes. Rhaenyr's absurd plan was based on a simplistic assumption that he could control me, and by extension, my entire nation without repercussion. The idea was beyond foolish and outright suicidal. If he somehow succeeded in subjugating me and my followers, it would only affect those directly under my command, certainly not Veldora and Velzard. I waited, letting the silence sink in, my expression unbothered as Rhaenyr's confidence visibly wavered. If he were smart, which I highly doubted, he'd be feeling the weight of his idiocy by now. Rhaenyr's defiance began to falter, his earlier arrogance splintering under the weight of what I'd said. But then, as if clinging to the last remnants of his pride, he puffed himself up and tried to bark back, though the panic in his eyes betrayed him. "So you really are just leaning on the power of the true dragons," he stammered, his voice a touch too loud. "Why, you're pathetic. You're no demon lord." His words sounded more desperate than scornful. A grin tugged at my lips. His bravado was paper-thin, and the power dynamic between us had tipped long ago. This was too perfect. "That's hilarious," I mused, barely containing a chuckle. In a flash, I reached out, snatching the bracelet from his hands before he could even register the movement. He glanced down, oblivious that his so-called trump card was no longer in his grasp. "Do you really think true dragons would ally themselves with a weakling?" I asked, my tone dripping with condescension. I held the bracelet up, letting the absurdity of his plan hang in the air for everyone to see. "You people really don't know anything about this world, do you?" I continued, my voice smooth and mocking. The irony of the statement wasn't lost on me. It had been less than 3 years since I arrived in this world, yet even I could see through their flimsy schemes. Rhaenyr and the other counselors finally noticed the bracelet in my hand, their eyes widening in horror. "Rimuru-sama, what are you doing?" the chairman asked, his voice trembling. "When did you take that from me? Monster!" Rhaenyr's voice cracked, barely able to believe what he was seeing. In response, I slowly raised my arm, the bracelet held high for all to witness. The entire room held its breath. Without hesitation, I slipped it onto my wrist, unfazed by the artifact's supposed power over me. A collective gasp echoed as I lowered my arm. The silence and tension that followed were suffocating, but I relished every second of it. "Well, where's the control? I feel just fine," I taunted, unable to hide my smirk. The color drained from Rhaenyr's face as he stumbled back, his expression twisted in disbelief. He nearly tripped over himself, scrambling to comprehend what had just happened, his desperate plan now in tatters. Off to my side, I saw Hinata striding over to Prince Elric, who now seemed paralyzed by dread. His earlier arrogance had shattered, leaving him pale and trembling, his face contorted in disbelief. "You really didn't listen to my advice, huh?" Hinata said, her voice laced with a cold disappointment. Elric was too shaken to respond, his wide, panicked eyes darting around the room as if seeking an escape. His lips moved wordlessly before he began muttering, This sea can't be. It's sea can't." His voice was fragile, barely a whisper, like that of a man grappling with his own madness. Hinata sighed, realizing any attempt to get an answer from him was futile. She turned her gaze to the adventurers and the hooded figure who accompanied the prince. They too were frozen in fear, their expressions betraying the deep regret etched across their faces. Meanwhile, Shuna and Testarossa stepped up beside me, their presence imposing and unyielding. Both wore expressions colder than ice, the calm rage radiating from them palpable. Rhaenyr, still stunned, took an uneasy step back, and the counselors sat in tense silence, their eyes darting nervously between us. "Who among you called for this disruption?" Testarossa asked, her voice level but carrying an undeniable weight that silenced any murmur. Her words echoed in the council chamber, slicing through the heavy atmosphere. "Rimuru-sama, this is a mistake. No one in the council called for this," the chairman stammered, panic lacing his tone as he looked desperately to the others for support. Several nobles nodded in vigorous agreement, their fear plain to see. I could sense the chairman's sincerity, yet there was no denying someone had orchestrated this entire plot from the shadows. "Will no one claim responsibility for this?" Shuna's voice was smooth, yet there was a hard, glacial edge to it. Her calm rage was more frightening than any shouted threat. Silence fell over the room. As I scanned the counselors, my gaze settled on one in particular. Unlike the rest, Gabon's fear was a shade deeper, his trembling more pronounced. Though he tried to mask it, his guilt was evident to anyone paying attention. "Fine. If no one will admit to their involvement, then I'll simply have to coerce the truth out of everyone," Testarossa announced, her eyes narrowing with a dangerous glint. With a single glance, her crimson eyes blazed momentarily, casting an eerie red light across the chamber. In that split second, an invisible wave of aura flooded the room. It was a silent storm that swept through, chilling everyone to their core. Though the phenomenon was invisible to human eyes, its effects were unmistakable. The counselors and intruders felt an inexplicable dread gripping their hearts, an all-consuming terror that stole the air from their lungs. Their skin grew clammy, their muscles locked, and a cold sweat ran down their backs. Then, seemingly beyond his own control, Gabon rose shakily to his feet. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with terror, and he swayed slightly as if something unseen held him in place. The others looked on, horrified by the unnatural sight they had just witnessed. Though they couldn't see the aura, the unnatural, oppressive fear pressing down on them left them paralyzed. This was a terror born of the unknown, a horror that lingered and clawed at the edges of their minds. "So was this it? Was this the master plan?" I asked, letting the disappointment settle into each word, my tone as unimpressed as if I'd just found a failed student's homework. I stepped forward, barely looking at Rimuru as I flicked my hand. With the faintest gesture, he was thrust aside by an invisible force, landing unceremoniously on the floor. I made sure he didn't slam into the wall, but the lack of any real effort on my part to keep him upright spoke volumes. In this theater of arrogance and deceit, he was nothing more than an inconvenience and an afterthought. Turning to face the counselors, I felt my expression sharpen. With my path clear, I glanced over the row of trembling faces, each one realizing the futility of their ploy. "And you really thought you could get away with this?" I asked, each word underscored with quiet authority. I pulled out a document from the imaginary space that held their fate and handed it to Testarossa. The chairman, the only one who seemed capable of rational thought at this point, spoke up, though his voice was quivering. What do you mean, Rimuru-sama?" Testarossa stepped forward with an elegance that made the air still. Every step she took was befitting of a noblewoman, controlled, serene, and commanding. Her presence contrasted with the chaos she was about to unleash on the conspirators. She paused, the paper held gracefully in her hands, and cleared her throat with a measured poise that captured everyone's attention. "Prince Elric has been caught red-handed bribing the members of this council," she began, her voice clear and dignified, each word precise and unyielding. The weight of her revelation silenced any further murmurings, and her words resonated through the chamber with chilling clarity. "He knew you would object to openly attacking Rimuru-sama in this meeting, and intended to hold a vote for the sake of formality," she continued, her words slicing through the room like a honed blade. Elric and Gabon, the two main culprits, couldn't mask the horror spreading across their faces, their expressions contorted with dread so potent that they were visibly trembling. What little hope they'd clung to was shattered as Testarossa recited the details of their scheme, exposing their deceit to everyone in the room. Beside them, I noticed several council members complicit in taking Elric's bribes becoming increasingly agitated, their guilty eyes darting about as they shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sowie sighed, a look of disappointment crossing his face as he assessed the pitiful display. With a single, swift motion, he summoned sticky steel thread, binding each of the bribed council members instantly. The threads wrapped around them tightly, hoisting them upright, their forced postures adding to their visible discomfort and horror. The room was silent save for the soft hum of Sowie's threads and the faint whimpers of those who, seconds earlier, thought they could control me. But as they stood bound, faces pale, the reality sank in. Their illusion of power had dissolved, and the consequences were about to begin. The chairman's face flushed as he regained his composure, the anger and disappointment etched deeply into his expression. "You people are a disgrace to diplomacy," he thundered, his voice unwavering as he turned his glare toward the guilty parties. "Prince Elric, can you imagine what your father would say if he saw this recklessness? This isn't just foolish, it's an insult to everything this council stands for." His words carried a bite that left Elric staring at the ground, his face drained of its usual haughty confidence. "And you, Count Gabin," the chairman's fury turned towards the noble, whose defiant expression quickly melted into shame. "Do you even realize that your idiocy could have plunged the entire West into ruin without a second thought?" he demanded, his disbelief evident. Each word seemed to shrink the conspirators, who stood frozen and unable to meet his eyes. But he wasn't done. His gaze shifted to the counselors who had taken bribes, his anger even more intense as he addressed them. "I cannot believe that you, of all people, would stoop to this level. Have you no honor? How could you, as representatives of your nations, allow yourselves to be bought so easily?" The bribed counselors could only look down, their faces heavy with guilt and regret, unable to respond under the weight of his reprimand. Watching the chairman defend the council's integrity like this was refreshing. He spoke out with the passion of someone who cared deeply about diplomacy, probably at the risk of losing his own standing. Someone in his position openly reprimanding a prince and his colleagues showed conviction, which I could respect. "Well, this is about as good an outcome as we could have hoped for. Listen," I let my voice cut through the tense silence, a calm contrast to the charged atmosphere. The attention shifted back to me as I addressed the room. My tone was steady but relaxed, loosening some of the tension that had been building. "I'm not so unreasonable that I won't respect international laws. I'm fine with Tempest and the West engaging in trade. I'm even willing to allocate forces to help keep the Eastern Empire in check. But given how some of you have acted, going so far as to try to manipulate me, I had to expose the sheer hypocrisy at play here." My voice was calm and controlled but firm, settling the room's unease. At my signal, Sowie released the bindings on the bribed counselors, letting them sink back into their seats. They were visibly relieved to finally breathe properly, though they still looked shaken. Prince Elric and his entourage were also slowly coming down from their panic. Rhaenyra remained off to the side, cowering in silence. Honestly, I didn't care about him enough to do more than ignore him. If Tempest is still welcome in this council, I'll look past this incident. If not, we'll part ways, at best with neutrality between us. My tone remained even, leaving no ambiguity in my offer. "Have I made myself clear?" I asked. A wave of nods rippled through the counselors. Their relief was palpable as they replied almost in unison, "Yes." Their response was barely out when I felt a deep sigh escape, the tension from the room earlier still weighing on me. I turned to face Elric and his bodyguards, noticing how they seemed visibly relieved, if still slightly shaken. Hinata, catching my gaze, gave me a subtle nod, her expression easing as if to say that things were finally calming down. "I'm detecting a murderous intent directed at Prince Elric." Huh. Instantly, I activated thought acceleration and universal perception. My senses sharpened, stretching over a kilometer away until I spotted a red-haired woman standing alone in a distant field. She raised a handgun, adjusting her aim toward empty air, and squeezed the trigger. I watched in confusion as the bullet left the barrel in exaggerated slow motion, with no apparent target in her vicinity. Then, a portal materialized, swallowing the bullet as it traveled along its trajectory. My gaze darted back to the council chamber, where the other end of the portal opened, aimed precisely at the back of Prince Elric's head. From my accelerated perspective, the bullet crept forward inch by inch, its deadly intent clear. But the world around me, appearing to move in slow motion, left no way to intercept it without risking collateral damage from my own speed. So this was the big plan, huh? They would frame me for his assassination. It's not a bad strategy had I been someone else. Rimuru's POV. Unfortunately, they'd heavily underestimated who they were dealing with. A dangerous smile crept onto my face as an idea formed. There was one thing I'd been meaning to try for a while, and this was the perfect opportunity. "Stop it all, Azathoth," I commanded, and the skill responded with chilling immediacy. In a single, terrifying instant, the world drained of color. Every inch of the room faded into an eerie grayscale, as though I'd slipped into an old, lifeless photograph. The sounds vanished, too, silencing even the faintest breath or heartbeat, leaving an oppressive stillness. Time itself halted, trapping everything in a frozen tableau. The counselors sat mid-breath, faces etched with expressions of tension or relief, and Hinata's nod remained incomplete, suspended as if by invisible threads. This was the suspended world, a reality beyond reality, a dimension where time itself ceased to flow, unraveling the usual rules of existence. To move here, I manipulated my existence on a level even smaller than the atomic scale, transferring myself between static clusters of information particles. This manipulation was the sole means of movement in time-stop. There was a fundamental principle that held across all worlds, one that can never be broken. The speed of light cannot and will never be exceeded. Movement, after all, is simply distance divided by time. If one tried to move in a timeless state, it would be like dividing by zero, which is a concept that reality won't allow. Information particles, however, are unique. With nearly zero mass, they exist outside the usual constraints of space and time, transmitting information instantly, with no time difference. By manipulating the information particles within myself and the static matter around me, I could move within this timeless state without defying the natural laws of creation. The weightlessness of this realm was surreal. Nothing moved, nothing sounded, and the laws of nature held no sway. The bullet was still caught mid-flight. It hung motionless in the air, its metallic glint dimmed in the black and white void. Around me, the atmosphere felt heavy, thick like liquid, with each movement leaving faint ripples that distorted the very fabric of this unnatural plane. I moved calmly, untouched by the eerie silence, knowing that I was in complete control here, in this suspended reality. My mind drifted briefly to Veldora and Velzard back home. They, too, could operate in this stilled reality, and I chuckled as I imagined their likely confusion at times suddenly stopping. I'd have some explaining to do when I got back. But now wasn't the time to linger. While it was exhilarating to wield such a power, time-stop had a significant downside. It had a ravenous drain on my magicules, far beyond any other skill or ability I possessed. Every second consumed my reserves at a steady, relentless rate. I estimated that I could hold this suspension for a few minutes at most before my energy was spent entirely. Carefully manipulating my infons, I approached the bullet, moving through the dense, syrupy air. Grabbing it mid-flight was surprisingly easy. It felt like plucking a leaf out of still water. With a slight adjustment, I erased the bullet's momentum, allowing it to sit, inert and harmless, in my hand. To think they'd try something like this, I muttered, placing the bullet aside before returning to my original position. I readied myself, feeling the weight of suspended time pressing against me. Time resume, I commanded, snapping my fingers. In an instant, color flooded back into the world, sounds rushed back, and the air around me lightened. To me, the sudden shift was almost overwhelming. It was a stark contrast to the thick silence that had held me moments before. Everyone continued as though nothing had happened, unaware that time had halted. They remained in the exact positions I'd left them in, none the wiser. Stepping through the fatting tension in the room, I approached Saoi, my expression a shade more serious than before. "Saoi, there was an attempted assassination just now," I said, keeping my voice low so only he could hear. I opened my fist to reveal the bullet resting in my palm, its metallic surface dull against my skin. Saoi's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise breaking through his otherwise stoic expression. "Understood. I will locate the culprit," he replied, his tone now mirroring the gravity of the situation. As Saoi melted into the shadows, disappearing to track down the shooter, Hinata, Shuna, and Testarossa stepped closer, each drawn by a mix of curiosity and apprehension as they inspected the bullet in my hand. Their expressions shifted, subtle reactions flashing across their faces. "Why do you have a bullet?" Hinata's voice was edged with concern, her brows knitting in confusion. "Someone tried to assassinate Prince Elric using a gun. The shooter isn't nearby. She fired from a distance and created a portal that lined up the bullet with Elric's head," I explained, watching as Hinata's initial confusion led to a slow-spreading disbelief. Shuna leaned in, intrigued, studying the bullet with the fascination of someone encountering something foreign yet compelling. On the other hand, Testarossa examined it with a calm and calculated look, as if she were already acquainted with this type of weapon. While I never had the chance to see one in action, I've heard rumors from the East about weapons capable of launching projectiles like this. "I assume this is one of those bullets," Testarossa murmured thoughtfully, her tone controlled, assessing the situation with her usual elegance. I nodded, confirming her suspicion. Her crimson gaze lingered a second longer on the bullet, her mind clearly working through the implications. Hinata, however, wasn't letting it go so quickly. Hold on." Her sharp tone snapped our attention back to her, her face a picture of growing urgency. "Yeah," I prompted, curious about what was on her mind. She hesitated for only a moment before launching into a flurry of questions. "How did you stop the bullet? Did you catch a glimpse of the shooter? You said she. Who exactly is this she? And how do you know she isn't nearby?" she demanded, her voice growing desperate. I raised a hand, trying to keep her from spiraling. "Whoa, slow down, I'll explain," I assured her. Taking a breath, I began. "Yes, I saw who fired the gun. It was a woman with short red hair, dressed in attire that looked strikingly similar to your Crusader's uniform." I paused, watching the recognition dawn on her face as her mouth parted slightly in shock. "And no, it can't be." Her voice was low, barely above a whisper as she processed what I'd said. "What is it?" I asked, feeling her growing tension. "Glendoret Lie," she muttered, her voice thick with disbelief. The name seemed to weigh heavily in the air, carrying implications I could only guess at. "Is that one of the members of the 10 Great Saints?" I asked curiously, my tone slightly more serious now. Hinata nodded, all but confirming that she'd been conspiring against Tempest. "I see. We'll have to discern her motives once Saoi apprehends her. Is that all right with you?" I asked, and she nodded again. "Yeah, while I've had a strange feeling about her for a while now, it's best if we get answers from her directly," she said. As we let the revelation about Glenda settle, a brief lull followed. The tension in the room dipped slightly, allowing everyone a short-lived moment of reprieve. But just as it seemed we might start wrapping up the incident, the sound of footsteps broke the silence, pulling our attention to the entrance. The new arrival was an imposing man, his gaze a blend of anger and deep disappointment. His aura held the weight of authority, radiating a presence that commanded respect and perhaps a bit of fear. King Ejil, the chairman stammered, his voice laced with shock. Ejil Sama, /F father. The simultaneous exclamations came from Count Gabin and Prince Elric. The contrast between their reactions and the king's composed, yet steely expression was striking. While they looked at him with a mix of awe and dread, he spared them only a cursory glance, his focus locked on me as he approached. I could feel the atmosphere in the room shift immediately. Some counselors rose respectfully, while others remained motionless, unable to shake the heavy tension his presence brought. Without acknowledging anyone who'd called out to him, he stopped a few steps in front of me. I truly apologize for the idiotic behavior of my son and Count Gabin, Rimuru. He began, his voice even and controlled but holding a firmness that left little room for argument. For a moment, I was surprised by the stark difference between his demeanor and that of his son. King Ejil's stance and tone carried the weight of a ruler, someone who knew the demands of his station. Unlike Elric, whose actions were impulsive and rash, his father's approach was dignified and grounded. "No need to concern yourself with it, Ejil-san," I replied, offering him a reassuring smile. He shook his head slightly. "It is my responsibility. They acted foolishly, unaware of the consequences their actions would bring upon themselves. I hope you can look past this incident, and I assure you they will be punished appropriately." His tone, though still respectful, held a subtle edge of disappointment that no doubt struck fear in Elric and Gabin. "Understood. I've already decided to let it go," I replied, my voice calm and assuring. My tone and softened expression seemed to ease the remaining tension, though not for Elric, Gabin, or Rhiannon, who visibly shrank under the king's imposing presence. The way the other counselors regarded Ejil with such deference made it clear that Ingracia's influence was formidable within the council. "You are much too kind, Rimuru," he replied with genuine respect, inclining his head slightly. Once he turned back to face the council, his expression hardened. "Guards," he commanded, his voice carrying an unyielding authority. Instantly, the guards stepped forward to seize Gabin and Rhiannon. Their protests filled the air as they were dragged from the room, but the king and the guards ignored their objections. King Ejil's expression didn't flicker, and his resolve was unmoved. Finally, he turned to his son. "Elric." The single word was enough to send a fresh wave of fear over the prince, who looked pale and visibly tensed. "We will have a long discussion later," King Ejil said, his voice dropping to a steely, dangerous tone that left no room for argument. At that moment, it was clear that any leniency from his father had evaporated. The king's authority bore down on Elric with an unmistakable weight. The room was silent, all eyes now on the prince, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else than in his father's sight. King Ejil grasped his son firmly by the arm, steering him towards the door, trailed by his loyal guards. But just as he reached the doorway, he came to an abrupt stop. The room grew silent, every gaze fixed on him as he turned back, his expression unwavering. "By the way," he began, his voice resonating with unmistakable authority. All eyes in the chamber were on him, and the weight of his presence was undeniable. His words were for more than just consideration, they were declarations. "Since you're all deciding on Tempest's admission into the council, I'll give my verdict here and now." The chairman and councilors leaned in, bracing for his verdict. Their anticipation was visible in their waiting with bated breath. "I hereby declare that Ingracia fully supports Tempest's inclusion in the Western Council. Remember, this decision is not from a representative but from myself," he finished his declaration. A ripple of surprise crossed several counselors' faces, taken aback by the king's unwavering stance. A few exchanged uncertain glances, whispering as they absorbed the impact of his words. By voicing his support, Ejil hadn't just cast a vote, he'd set a precedent, ensuring Tempest would have the full weight of Ingracia's influence behind it. He turned to leave, his statement seemingly final, but the chairman's voice broke through. halting him once more. "W8 King Egil," he called out. "Yes," Egil replied, his voice as steady as before but with a touch of challenge in his gaze. "We still intend to discuss the matter with Rimuru-sama himself. Are you certain you don't want to stay and hear if he has any counteroffers or conditions of his own?" the chairman asked, barely concealing his uncertainty. The king chuckled, low and unbothered. "Whatever Rimuru-dono's conditions may be, it will not change my decision. I've ascertained that he's here with good intent and I stand by my choice," he declared, casting a final look around the room, his gaze firm. "Make of that what you will. Just know that Ingracia stands in full support of his nation." I couldn't help but let a small smile escape. Ingracia's support, as declared by its king, was a powerful assurance which had just been laid out before the council. Without another word, King Egil, his son, and his guards departed, leaving the chamber in a stunned silence as his words reverberated through the room. As the tension dissipated, Testarossa stepped closer, her expression pleased as she glanced around the now quiet room. "I suppose things turned out excellently for us in the end," she mused, satisfaction clear in her voice. I chuckled at her choice of words. "You could say that again," I replied. Beside me, Shuna let out a small giggle, her eyes bright with relief. "While it wasn't ideal, we got what we wanted, Rimuru-sama," she added. "Yeah, but we still have to wait on the council's decision," I reminded her, grinning. Shuna nodded, her hopeful smile unfading. When I turned back to the councilors, their faces told a different story than they had initially. There was no longer fear or apprehension, no calculating glances or tense expressions. The recent show of loyalty from King Egil had reshaped their perception of me. Where there had once been suspicion, now there was respect and a hint of admiration. Feeling an impulse to clear away the last traces of the earlier commotion, I stepped forward and snapped my fingers. The sound echoed across the chamber, drawing every eye back to me just in time to witness what seemed like a minor miracle unfold. In one smooth wave, the room restored itself. The chairs slid back into place, desks realigned, the splintered door mended itself, and the cracked walls knit together, leaving no trace of the chaos. It was effortless yet profound, and the counselors' astonished expressions reminded me that such things weren't everyday occurrences for them. They stared in awe, their skepticism fading into genuine wonder as if they had just witnessed the impossible. And with this newfound sense of ease, I knew we could finally proceed as equals. I reclaimed my seat, settling back comfortably as Shuna and Testarossa took their places beside me. Placing my elbows on the table, I rested my chin on my hands, letting a warm smile settle on my face. "Now that all the disturbances are out of the way," I said, looking at each council member in turn, "let's continue with your verdicts, shall we?"